The Useless Bugbreeders by James Stamers. Narrated by William Skye. This story is brought to you by one of my fantastic Patreon backers, Cassard. Thank you so much for your support. To the Space Council, asteroid 4722 was just another roadblock in the way of interplanetary traffic. But to the Useless Bugbreeders, it was home. The previous case was a weeper, and he lost. So the Space Zoning Commissioners were damp and irritable before I opened pleadings for my client. I tried not to squelch as I approached the bench. "Not the flammables again, Mr. Jones?" the fat commissioner asked nastily, sponging his suit with a sodden handkerchief. "This was last week, Your Honour." The thin, dark commissioner stared pointedly at the charred end of the bench nearest the witness seat. "Indeed it was, Mr. Jones." The middle commissioner poised his fingers and looked at the court ceiling. Moisture gleamed diamond-like on his bald head. "Now let me see," he intoned. "Correct me if I err, Mr. Jones, but I seem to observe you have a habit of representing somewhat spectacular aliens, including in the past 6 months alone the drillers, whirling tombs, fragile glasses, eruptors, vibrational men, transparent women, and, of course, let us not forget the flammables. I assure Your Honour, my present clients will be found to be sober, hard-working, desirable members of the galactic community seeking only to live on their own asteroid in peace under a democratic system which—" "Thank you, Mr. Jones. Shall we proceed?" "And perhaps," added the fat commissioner, "you may be good enough to leave us with most of our courtroom intact on this occasion." The thin commissioner sighed and shuffled his papers. "You appear, Mr. Jones, to contest a Space Council ruling for the elimination of asteroid 4722 on the grounds, which you allege, that it is a peaceful dwelling of an adult and responsible alien race." "Yes, Your Honour." "Then let us see your adult, bug breeder." I shuffled uncomfortably and splashed the court stenographer, who gave me a dirty look. "A space tramp's name given in the early days of space, Your Honour. More properly, my clients are the selective culturists of bacteria and lesser life." The fat commissioner sniffed. "Bug breeders will do," he said. "Produce one." My client hopped off the table and ran nimbly up to the witness seat. He sat there like a small green snowball with large and pointed ears. Happy to be here, I'm sure," he said. Fortunately, he had a hand to raise and looked reasonably humanoid as he was sworn in. The caterpillar and semi-jelly cultures make a less favourable first impression, and at this point the driller had gone excitedly through the floor. "You are a representative member of your race?" I asked formally. "Oh, yes, much." "And you reside on asteroid 4722, the permanent dwelling of your race?" "Oh, yes, home." "And although your home presents certain technical difficulties for interplanetary vehicles on the space run to the greater planets, you maintain it should be preserved because of your contribution to the culture of the galactic community?" I asked. "Oh, yes." "Does he understand a word you're saying, Mr. Jones?" asked the bald commissioner. "Oh, yes, not much," said my client cheerfully. "Humph," I said and coughed. "Perhaps I may assist," suggested the thin commissioner with a nasty look at me. "What exactly does your race do?" "Breed bugs, I'm sure. I'm head bacteriophysicist, name of Lude. I'm good scientist." "And what exactly do you do with these bugs you raise?" "Most everything." "Your Honours," I interrupted, "at this point I propose a few simple demonstrations of what Mr. Lude and his people can do." "May I inquire if either of my learned brethren know any way in which we can charge Mr. Jones with rebuilding costs if necessary?" asked the bald commissioner. "Your Honours, I assure you—" "Proceed at your peril, Mr. Jones." I walked over to the exhibit table and pointed to a row of jars. Exhibits A through G, Your Honours. Samples of food and beverages produced by my clients without raw materials and from the expert culture of bacteria. I held up a jar full of mauve fungus. It was the most attractive example. I would hardly call feeding on funguses a sign of a responsible humanoid race, Mr. Jones. Perhaps Your Honour will recall the part played by bacteria in making milk, cheese, wine, beer, bread. The commissioners looked at each other and nodded reluctantly. So I passed the jars up to them, secure in the knowledge they had been tested by the Alien Foods Bureau. I watched the commissioners unscrew the lids and taste the contents somewhat hesitantly. "Not bad," confessed the fat commissioner eventually. "Quite palatable. Of course, we already have honey and similar foodstuffs, Mr. Jones." "Naturally, Your Honour, but Mr. Lude's race can survive without extraplanetary aid. Provided they have sunshine and water, they can breed their spores and bacteria with no other resources." "You mean," said the thin commissioner with a dark leer, "that almost any sunny planet would do for them?" Somewhere along the line my point seemed to have been swept away, so I added hurriedly, "I offer this evidence purely to show the high degree of civilization of my client's culture, as cause why they should not be deprived of their native land." "Oh, yes," my client agreed. "Mr. Lude," intoned the bold commissioner, "to stay on your present asteroid, you will have to prove that your race offers something that cannot be found elsewhere in the galactic community. Now, have these funguses of yours any special medicinal values, for example?" "Please?" "Can you cure diseases with them?" "Oh, no." "Ah," said the thin and fat commissioners together. "Proceed, Mr. Jones." That put Lude somewhere back behind the 20th century discoverers of penicillin and the mycins, and even back behind the pioneer Pasteur. 500 years back, in fact. "Yes, well, let's see how my clients handle housing, Your Honours. I think you'll find this quite revolutionary. Mr. Lude?" Lude hopped off the witness seat and trotted up to the long table normally reserved for attorneys. Lately I have found my professional colleagues strangely reluctant to stay in court when I have a case, so Lude had the entire table to himself. He pulled a small jar out from under the table and spread a pile of dust on the tabletop. Then he unscrewed the jar and gently poured nothing out of it onto the dust. Nothing visible, that is, but I assumed it was teeming with viruses and such. "While Mr. Lude gets this started, Your Honours," I said, hoping the viruses or whatever were not fatal to humans, "may I submit the usefulness of fungus foods for space travel and for pioneers on inhospitable planets?" "Are we having difficulties with general food concentrates, the Traveller's Capsule Combine, and the other 10,000 concerns in this line, Mr. Jones?" the bold commissioner asked quietly. "You can't say I didn't try." I shut up and watched Lude fuss with the dust on the table. It started moving as if it were bubbling, and Lude stood back. Slowly, the dust on the table formed itself into a brick, a long 8 by 6 by 3 inch brick. Lude smiled happily. "And here, Your Honours," I said triumphantly, "here is automatic housing." "One brick does not make a house, Mr. Jones. If Your Honours will just watch..." The brick slowly elongated and split into 2 perfect bricks, lying on the table end to end. "Mass colony action of bacteria," said Lude wisely. "Oh, yes." The 2 bricks each split into 2 further bricks. These divided and multiplied themselves while we watched out to the end of the table. "I would like Your Honours to observe the way these bricks overcome natural hazards," I said, getting into my stride. I pointed to the bricks drooping over the end of the table. A brick fell onto the floor at each end, then built itself up until it joined the line of bricks on the table, forming a perfect arch at each angle. The line on the table was now 3 bricks high, so I walked round and stood behind the wall. "You see, Your Honours, suppose I need a house. I merely combine these suitable microbes and dust, and there we are, a house." I had to stand on tiptoe to finish the sentence because of the mathematics involved. Every brick was doubling and redoubling itself in just under a minute, and the wall was getting quite impressively high. "Mr. Jones," called one of the commissioners. It was not until I tried to walk round the end of the wall that I found I had been outflanked. I ran to the nearest wall of the courtroom, but the bricks got there first. I heard a rending noise that suggested the other end had gone clean through the opposite wall. As a matter of fact, I saw the astonished face of an attorney entering the main door of the Justice Building as the wall advanced towards him. Then he saw me. He grinned and waved. I was in no mood to wave back. "Mr. Lude! Mr. Lude!" I yelled. "Can you hear me?" "Wall too thick, yes," came a muffled answer. And indeed it was. I had not noticed it, but the wall was expanding sideways as well. I was calculating the approximate thickness when it went up and through the roof of the courtroom. Fortunately, it was a nice sunny day. However, this was no time to sunbathe, and I dashed towards the hole in the courtroom wall where Lude's wall had gone through. I just got out before a buttress coming out of the wall at right angles blocked the gap. I remembered something Lude had said about the automatic creation of full-scale houses on a simple standard plan, 2 rooms, a toilet and a patio. Outside, the wall was well on the way towards completing its second simple house. This side of the wall was, that is. I could only assume it was doing something similar on the other side. There was no way of getting round and seeing except by outstripping the wall in a sprint. I gathered my breath and dignity and ran very rapidly down the length of the wall, round the far-mounting tiers of brick, advancing now on the State Library, and back to where I had left the commissioners and Mr. Lude. I was faced by a thicket of patios and arched doorways and low-roofed houses. "Your Honours! Your Honours!" I called hopefully, walking into the maze in the general direction of what appeared to be an old and ruined war monument. It then occurred to me that this was the outer wall of the courthouse. It stood far off, pointing a stone finger to the sky as if going down in a sea of brick for the 3rd time. "Your Honours! Your Honours!" I met them turning a corner. Unfortunately, they seemed to have found it necessary to crawl through a broken gap of some sort. They were very dusty and had a slightly shredded appearance. "Ah, Mr. Jones," they said grimly, dusting each other off. A tremendous crash announced the falling in of the roof of the State Library. "Well," said the thin commissioner, "he did say it was revolutionary." I smiled politely. "Don't giggle, Mr. Jones, or we'll hold you in contempt." We wound out of the maze in single file. A pattering behind us announced Lude bringing up the rear. Once we were out and about 200 yards ahead of the advancing walls, patios and houses, the 3 commissioners turned on me. "Mr. Jones," they said with restraint, "you will now stop this reckless building project." I turned to Lude. "You must stop it," I said. "Oh, yes," he agreed, nodding happily. "Most marvellous, no? Ample housing for all and sundry. Homes for peoples. Immediate occupancy. You like basic plan house, yes?" "Mr. Lude," snarled the fat commissioner, "the problem on every habitable planet so far has been to find room to build. Earth is congested." Distant crashing informed me that an unprecedented house clearing was still going on. "And so are all authorized planets yet discovered. I speak for my learned brethren in saying that this anthill of yours is one thing the galactic community can do without." "And do without right now," added his bald colleague. "You wish to stop?" asked Lude. Small tears filled the periphery of his round eyes. "Yes," I confirmed brutally. "Can you stop it?" "Oh, yes. Must have antiseptics." It took the fire department 4 hours of spraying from their copters to reduce the entire housing estate to dust. And then an even blanket of brown feathery residue lay unbroken for several acres, save here and there where the shells of previous buildings stood up gauntly and accusingly. "All bugs gone," said Lude sadly. "But what about this mess?" demanded the bald commissioner. "Comes out of air," Floating particles. Processed cleans air, too. A fresh wind from across the blanket of dust came inopportunely to punctuate Mr. Lude's remark. As soon as they could talk again, the commissioners suggested resuming in another city. Assuming, Mr. Jones, you wish to produce further aspects of your, case. 6 red and bleary eyes stared at me from a coating of brown dust of only vaguely judicial appearance. I think, Your Honours, the next evidence had better be delivered in the open, I said, and pointed to a nearby park. Much, if not all, of the dust fell off us as we walked over to the small green hill in the centre of the park. The birds twittered, the sun shone, the breeze was fresh, and after the commissioners had settled on convenient tree stumps, I felt quite hopeful about the third line of evidence. Lude stood optimistically by. Your Honours, I said, you are aware that Earth suffers a grave shortage of metals. Almost all economical quantities have been mined out. Yet, Your Honours, I paused dramatically, in the hematin of human blood alone, whose main function is to carry oxygen to the system, there is nearly twice as much iron by weight as oxygen. Precisely which of us, Mr. Jones, do you propose to mine first? I cleared my throat and let the thin commissioner's remark pass. Merely making the point, Your Honour, that the metal-carrying properties of bacteria have been hardly considered. This was stretching it a bit because selective breeding of microbes for the recovery of metals in tailings have been developed back in the 1950s. But so far as I knew, no one had carried it as far as my client race. Mr. Lude, I commanded. Just one moment, Mr. Jones, said the bold commissioner dryly. Let us have an outline of this before we start. Certainly, Your Honour. Mr. Lude will now extract gold from a sample of ocean water we have obtained. I signalled to the waiting carrier, and it came trundling softly over the grass and deposited a large tank on the grass. Genuine, untouched ocean water, Your Honours, I said, slapping the tank. Go ahead, Mr. Lude. The little fellow hopped up to the side of the tank and emptied another invisible hoard from a test tube into the water. We waited. Oh, yes, he said. And there, on the bottom of the tank, was an unmistakable sludge of metallic gold, shining speckled in the rays of sunlight bending through the water. I scooped out a sample and handed it round for the commissioners to inspect. Subject to analysis, grunted the fat one. This certainly seems to be gold. Of course, there is no reason why this should not be done on Earth as a starting point. The thin commissioner paused and looked at my client. Does this process affect fish? Oh, yes, said Lude. Kills all parasites, fish, reptiles, and such. Thank you, said the commissioner dryly. Mr. Lude looked at me apologetically. My people too small to tolerate fish, he explained. Fish most dangerous wild beasts. Oh, yes. Never mind, I reassured him. Your Honours, I feel the court will take a more favourable view of the dry land operation then. Taking place as it does in the bowels of the earth, there is no danger to valuable livestock. And here we can demonstrate, for example, simple aluminium extraction by the progressive reduction and oxidation and reduction of bacteria on a molecular scale. I hope, I added, this experiment will produce visible evidence of this great boon to mankind, though I must ask your honours to watch closely. Lude produced another test tube, pressed a small hole in the grass with his finger, and emptied the tube. The hole darkened. Nothing happened. Perhaps a dud batch? I asked eventually. Oh, no, said Lude. We peered intently into the small hole without seeing anything. Then a faint wisp of steam came out of the hole. I walked over the grass, picked up a long twig, walked back and thrust it into the hole. I could not touch the bottom, so something was going on down there. The edges of the hole began to gleam with white metal. I was about to explain the alumina content of common clay when the thin commissioner and the tree stump he was sitting on went down with a whistling sound into a sudden pit that opened beneath him. I only just caught the third and last commissioner in time. We watched his tree stump sinking out of sight together. The ground began to quiver uneasily. "Let us get out of here with all haste." I followed the direction of the court with proper professional zeal, and we just made it to the safe, stressed concrete surface of the old freeway when the park melted completely into a stark framework of aluminium. Seated in the middle and peering at us through the aluminium cage were the other two commissioners. They did not seem particularly happy. Around them, in a widening belt, there opened up a pit of gleaming aluminium, melting, so to speak, towards the horizon on all sides. "You realize, I suppose, Mr. Jones," said the bald commissioner beside me, "that your client is in the process of eating up the earth." He breathed heavily. Lude was beaming and hopping up and down at the success of his experiment. I touched him in the general area of a shoulder. He looked at me. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "No?" "No." His round eyes became tearful and his little green body shook. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." "Antiseptics?" I asked. "Oh yes," he confirmed sadly. Very fortunately, the fire department was still observing my client, and me, I suspected afterwards, ridiculous as that may seem. This time it took them several hours of deep spraying and drilling to confine the area. A vast saucer of aluminium remained. "Useful for signalling to stars, oh yes?" asked Lude hopefully. "Oh no," I said. A threatening cough made me turn round to see the three commissioners staring at me. "Mr. Jones, you have now destroyed the courthouse, the public library, and 5 city blocks, and buried them under a filthy layer of dust, and reduced a park into a great garbage pit. We therefore refuse your claim and give you and your client 6 hours to get off Earth, and kindly do not trouble to advise us where the Space Council moves you. We will sleep more soundly for believing that it will be many, many light years away." And they turned and walked away, leaving me with my client and apparently my travelling companion. A quiet and suppressed sobbing made me turn and look at Lude. He wept dolefully. "We have nothing," he said. "Oh no, we have nothing to offer, nothing that you humans want." "Well," I said, "that's the way it goes sometimes." And what, I wondered, was I going to do for a living now? "Free food," gulped Lude. "Free housing, free gold and metals. We had all hoped so much from this. Oh yes." There did not seem any point in telling him his people were several hundred years too late. Once upon a time he would have been hailed as a saviour of a starving and poor human race, a great benefactor of mankind. Now he was just a nuisance, and I was another for letting him loose. "Well," I assured him, "you have got one guest until they shift you off your asteroid. Me. Free food and housing will suit me fine, and maybe we'll find some very backward part of the galaxy where they need gold and such. It's a pity," I added as we started to walk towards the spaceport, "that you can't control these bacteria of yours." "Can control?" "It didn't look like it, my friend." "Oh yes, can control bodily leukocytes, corpuscles and such. Perfect cell replacement easy." I looked down at him. "If it's all that easy, I suppose your old men can run faster than your houses." "No old men," said Lude. "Well, old whatever you ares." "No old. Not die. Oh yes, perfect cell replacement." I stood very still. "Do you mean you never die?" I asked. "Oh yes, never die." "Can teach?" I asked. "Oh yes, most simple," smiled Lude. "Can teach all men not die, not ever." But I was off running after the 3 commissioners, yelling until they stopped and stood waiting for me. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more every Monday and Friday. And if this kind of story is up your street and you'd like to listen to a full novel with a similar theme, I recommend Little Fuzzy by H. Beam Piper. I've narrated the whole story and it's on my channel, with a link you can follow on screen now.